Coming up, it's been a long time since we talked the Marvel run of the Transformers comics, but we'll jump back to the US continuity. We'll find out the fate of Optimus Prime and Megatron. Plus, we'll meet a new villain in the Mechanic, and the Decepticons will receive one big reinforcement from Cybertron right now on Transformers University. Hello, my friend, and welcome to Transformers University. This is episode 81. I am your host, Anthony Brucali, owner, operator, madman behind TFU.INFO, the website. This podcast, TFU News and Views, the social media, the YouTube channel, and so much more. And I hope you're all staying home, staying safe, washing your hands, and keeping away from the COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak. I am back up north with my family in New York and have been here for about a month and will probably be here for at least another month. If you've been following me on TFU News and Views or you're part of our Patreon over at patreon.com/TFU.INFO, you know there's been a lot of movement in my life lately, and you'll also know there's been a lot of other work going on other than the podcast. The website has been updated into the new look for 2002, and I am starting on 2003, and that's probably a conversation for another day, but just to give you an idea of how many entries and how much the line blew up in 2003 before we continue on our journey through 1986. I have a folder for every entry in TFU.info on the site. If you look at the URLs, you can kind of figure out how it's laid out. So in 2003, in all the individual toy folders, there are 378 entries for that year, and I can tell you that year is certainly not complete. So when you want to think about when the Transformer toy line really exploded in a combination of popularity with kids and nostalgia for adults, it is the beginning of the Unicron trilogy in 2002-2003, but that's a conversation for another day. Today, we are talking Marvel Transformers numbers 24 through 27, the U.S. story, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here because this stuff came out at the end of 1986, so probably about, I think, this takes us through September, October, November, and December. So we're talking a month after Transformers the movie hit theaters, or not even a month, within a month of the movie hitting theaters. So we have a couple of important storylines here, starting with Transformers number 24. Now, this issue was written by Bob Budiansky, pencils by Don Perlin, inks by Akins and Garvey, letters by Janice Chang, colors by Nel Yomtov, edits by Don Daly, and a cover by Herb Trimpe. Now, one of the more interesting things to note about this batch of stories is how much further on they took place in the UK run of the comic. So we left off with Marvel UK number 88, and that almost wraps up 1986 for the comics series in the UK. We have one more episode planned for that, and that only covers one issue and an annual. And that issue is issue 93. These stories start in issue 105 for Marvel UK run. So there is a whole batch of things that happen. Some of the stuff we've covered already for the US series, some of the stuff we haven't covered yet, which affects the storylines here. And I will make note of that, the things that are different, but I will try not to get too into detail with spoilers because I want you to be able to experience those stories when we get to them, covering 1987, which will probably be sometime later this year. Now, of course, the UK versions had different covers. You know, one is always kind of a version of the cover that the US got, and that would be issue 106. And for this story, issue 105 had a cover by Lee Sullivan, with the words "deadlock" in exclamation point on the cover, and you basically have Optimus and Defensor on one side and Bruticus and Megatron on the other, all about to face off. The Herb Trimpe cover for this one features Optimus and Megatron on a screen with a kid with a mullet playing joysticks on a video game, and that kind of gives us a hint as to what's inside this story. And it reads, "Game over, Optimus Prime." Now, the title of this issue is actually After Death, and at the start of this issue, we meet Ethan Zachary, who works in a science lab and uses the giant screen and supercomputer there to play video games. This lab also has a piece of technology called the hydrothermocline, and that will be important throughout this story. Ethan, while playing his video games, gets interrupted by his coworker, Margaret. Not sure if she goes by Peggy, but she does go by Margaret. She has actual work to do, so Ethan takes a break and then resumes his game when he is done. He notes that he has his character saved on a disc, and he also mentions he has, and I'm going to quote this, what we gamesters call a backdoor. You know, the word gamesters never really stuck, huh? We need to bring that one back, especially for the folks in the online gaming community. Gamesters seems like a fun word to play around with. Anyway, it's just a password that cheats him back to where he left off. The password is After Death, like the title of this story, and lets him reinsert himself anywhere in the game. On the roof of this facility, Vortex, in his helicopter mode, is spying. How no one hears this is beyond me. Helicopters are loud. The game is called Multi-World, and it is made by a company called Flippy Floppy Industries. I got my swim trucks and my flippy floppies. Back at the Ark, Wheeljack removes a Cerebro shell found in Optimus, and that goes back to a previous story we talked about, and then reverse engineers it to use it to spy on the Decepticons. So he takes what is a microphone and turns it into a listening device, and we find out the Decepticons plan to steal the hydrothermocline. That night, Megatron and the Combaticons arrive at the energy installation, and Optimus and the Protectobots are there too. There's really no explanation for either the Combaticons or the Protectobots and how they got there, at least in the U.S. continuity, but we do have a standoff. In the middle of this standoff fight, Bruticus catches Ethan Zachary fleeing. EZ has an offer for both sides to avoid unnecessary destruction. I want to play a game. See, Megatron doesn't want the hydrothermocline destroyed, Optimus doesn't want life destroyed, so why not settle this by playing a video game that probably sounded more like this. Shall we play a game? So Ethan Zachary hooks everyone up to the game. The winner will get the hydrothermocline. Megatron decides he wants to up the stakes. The loser, Optimus or Megatron, gets blown up in real life. Sure, why not? I guess Ethan Zachary had some explosives laying around because he hooks two joysticks up to each robot, and they are triggered to blow them up. They're basically Atari joysticks with the little button on top, and Ethan Zachary reminds them they have potential allies in-game. You know, in a fun moment here, when he says that, Megatron, demands to know who these people are. Tell me, human. But they do not let him know who the allies are in the game. Everyone goes into the game. The Protectobots decide to guard Optimus Prime, and Megatron sends his Combaticons to hunt the Autobots. Now, the Protectobots defeat the Combaticons through a series of battles in the game, wherein the Protectobots respect the quote-unquote local people and environment, and they turn into game-changing allies. Eventually, Megatron will roll up on Optimus Prime, but the Protectobots form Defensor. In real life, Megatron berates his Combaticons, and Vortex tells him about the back door, Afterlife. Defensor sacrifices himself to defeat Megatron, and they fall down a bottomless pit, if you will. And Megatron then uses his cheat code and returns into the game directly behind Optimus Prime and shoots him in the back. Damn, it feels good to be a gamester. Prime holds onto a ledge, nearly falling down this bottomless pit to his death, but pulls a tower down on Megatron. That tower contains some of this local life inside, and the locals die along with Megatron. In real life, Optimus feels like he violated his own ethics and demands that Ethan Zachary blow him up. And he does so, and from there we get this gorgeous splash page of Optimus Prime being blown to itty-bitty bits with the phrase, "Game over."
Game over, man! It's game over!
And so, the Decepticons get the hydrothermocline, the Autobots leave with Optimus's corpse, and Ethan, we find out, has backed up Optimus's entire brain on a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk. And just for you computer geeks out there, did a little research. It's a touch before my time playing with computers. I mean, I remember 5 1/4 floppy disks, but I didn't know much about computers then. Those hold a whopping 360 kilobytes. So Optimus's brain apparently was 360 kilobytes or less. That said, this is a really important and poignant issue of this comic series. And for more on his personal memories of this issue, I'm going to toss it over to Delvin Williams of the Long Box Crusade and Transformers Chronicles.
Hey everybody, I am Delvin Williams, aka The Dark Web. You would find me on the Long Box Crusade Network, and more particular to this podcast, you might be interested in what I do over on Transformers Chronicles, the Marvel Years, where I, Pat Sampson, aka DJ Christados, and Jonathan Schaefer-Hames from Married with Comics podcast and the Rod Pod all discuss the Marvel Years of Transformers Comics. I was asked to discuss issue 24 of Transformers, Game Over Optimus Prime. I remember that as the first book that I ever picked up, comic book, anything, and clearly it had an impact on me. I collected Transformers for the rest of its run, and I started a long and continuous love affair with comic books as a result of it. But as for the book itself, I could talk a while about it, and I was given 1 to 5 minutes, so I won't take too much of that time. Let's talk about how Bob Budiansky first takes something that was relevant at the time, relevant now, video games, and finds a way to work the Transformers universe seamlessly into that world. He found a way to do that a lot in the run that I've read so far. We're up to issue 14 as of this recording for Transformers Chronicles. So for me, I've read 1 through 14 recently and then jumped to 24 for this recording. And Bob does a good job of taking the improbable and making it plausible for giant alien robots to find a way to assimilate themselves into the human world. And it's always interesting and fascinating how he finds a plausible way to do that. The book itself, I could talk a lot about it, but ultimately I'm going to talk about the most important Transformer in my eyes, and that's Optimus Prime. He has to be one of the hardest characters in the world to write because in a way he's an archetype. He is Captain America, he is Superman, and you have to figure out what you're going to do with him. Sometimes you can make him into just that insufferable do-gooder. Sometimes you can make him into that he is the type that's always going to do right no matter what, or he's going to try to do right. And Optimus Prime was all of that in this issue. He is the type of person or type of robot who will do right no matter what. He wants to protect life at all costs. And with the person or the being of immense power that Optimus Prime is, that's an admirable trait, even to the effect of going into a video game realm and wanting to protect life in that realm, which is something that has huge ramifications even till today, 2020. If you read some of the Iron Man and how the robotic beings want to be treated as their own individuals and not just tools of the human universe. So interesting how Bob did that. And then at the end, I would say that Optimus Prime took it a little bit too far. He did what he had to do to win in the video game, but he wanted those consequences of costing those lives in this video game simulation to cost him in the real world. And that is something I don't know if any being, human or otherwise, ever would have done, but it speaks to the character that Optimus Prime was, that he would do it. Personally, I think he's kind of a sucker for detonating himself when he won the game and Megatron cheated first, but it shows the ultimate being that Optimus Prime is. So more and more kind of fall in love with the guy for having the courage to detonate himself over his own beliefs. This was an excellent read. I'm glad that I picked it up and looked at it again because I'm able to see it through my adult eyes as opposed to when I first read the book when I was about 8 or 9 years old. It was a fascinating read, and I thank you guys so much for giving me the opportunity to revisit this book and to share it with your podcast universe. Thank you very much.
And Delvin makes some great points there. You can catch him on the Long Box Crusade and on their Transformers podcast, where they cover this particular series of the Marvel books, Transformers Chronicles, where they cover this particular series of Transformers comics and do a great job. You can find that basically anywhere you listen to this show. Now, one of the things he pointed out was that this was one of his first comics, and I gotta say, this issue and the next issue we're about to talk about were also some of my very first comics. I can remember getting them at Tri-County Indoor Flea Market in, I guess it's Levittown, New York, in Long Island. It's still there. It's called Unique now, but it's basically it's the indoor mall, what they would call in Mall Rats as the Dirt Mall. But there was this neat bookstore / comic book shop that I remember being in the corner of that place on the first floor, and that's where I started getting into Transformers comics. It's where I got the digest versions, which were like these little tiny versions that had 2 comics in them, but they were about the size of a copy of Reader's Digest. And I remember getting issues 24 and 25 there for sure. And we're going to move on to issue 25. Gone But Not Forgotten is the title, written by Bob Budiansky, pencils by Don Perlin, inks by Aiken and Garvey, edits by Nell Yomtov, letters by Janice Chang, and edits by Don Daly. Now, the cover here is by Herb Trimpe and features Megatron in a showdown with the Combaticons. Now, the interesting thing about this art, something I discovered recently about this cover, the original art for it is out there, and it is slightly different than what was printed. It appears that if you Google search for this cover, because it's around, it appears that parts of the Predacons were cropped inward and redrawn. It's really neat to see how it's not incredibly different than the original, than what was printed on the cover, but there are certainly bits of detail that you do not see on the final version that are in the original art. So I highly recommend Googling it. And I know what, I will tweet out. I think I've retweeted it from someone before, but it's really neat to see them. Maybe I'll Photoshop them side by side so that we can see both the original cover as printed and the original art as not printed. Now, this issue took place in the UK over issues 107 and 108. 107 features artwork by David Hine and Robin Bautel. We've talked about David Hine here before. Robin Bautel, colorist at Marvel UK, and now works as a sculptor. Features Megatron on a rampage with the phrase rampage, but not the Predacon rampage. And does feature a pretty beat up version of the Combaticon brawl. And that's something that happens in this issue, but I am not going to tell you about it. For more on this issue, I'm going to toss it over to Gaby. Stick his head in gravy, wash it out with bubblegum, and send it to the Navy. Gabriel Owens, the Salty Seaman.
Hey folks, Salty Seaman here, Gabriel Owens, reviewing issue 25 of the original Transformers G1 Marvel run. Specifically requested this issue as one I had as a kid. Interestingly, I do not have the one in between. So it was very interesting. I as a kid did not own the issue where Prime dies in the video game. So I found that out in the flashback. So this whole issue, with Megatron kind of going going through some stuff, man. He's going through some things. PTSD. A lot of interesting things about this issue. Probably didn't even pick up as a kid. Like I never could figure out why he went so crazy. And there is like a somewhat explanation many issues later, but for as it stands, this issue was very weird, and it was it's mostly like Budansky just was like could not wait to get rid of Optimus Prime and Megatron. Like he just I don't know why, but Prime really has a really short run in the early part of the comics. He's in the original miniseries, then he's basically ahead, so he's kind of not. He's part of the story, but he's really not. He's not mobile, and then he's like for like half a year, he's back to being the leader, and then he kills himself, or at least a little longer than a year. But anyway. And say with Megatron, he was gone. Shockwave, it was very obvious. I thought he liked Shockwave a lot better than Megatron. Always how I felt about the comics. And I don't know how I felt about that as a kid. Like I really liked the Shockwave character in the comic, just how badass and intimidating he was. But I always thought, why are they giving Megatron such a short shrift? But I guess maybe he also had the cartoon, so hey, not like he wasn't getting enough exposure. So this is a real deep, dark dive. The cover alone, just looking at this, Megatron's all tore up and he's fighting the Predacons. That's what and it's so very weird when you first get the comic. Like, okay, why is Megatron fighting the Predacons? They're all Decepticons. Of course, assuming you knew who they were ahead of time, which I did as a kid, but was unaware of the issue before, and like just hey, think of an issue to miss, right? So, anyways, let's get to it. Issue 25. Should be noted, the cover says Megatron's Last Stand. The actual title is Gone But Not Forgotten. So we start off the issue with the Army, or the U.S. government, has had enough of the Decepticons brazenly just living down in this coal mining pit. So they decided, screw environmental concerns about attacking and what all the coal displacement would do. We're going in after them. And we cut to Shockwave talking to Cybertron. They're going to set up this energy doohickey down in the Caribbean. He makes passing mention about Cobra, like we tell Cobra what we're doing. We're moving our operations. Because at this point, they there's the ongoing G.I. Joe Transformers miniseries, which I'm sure will be covered future episodes. So that's kind of a little nod to the ongoing miniseries. And then we cut to Megatron on his throne, just as the army is attacking, and Shockwave and Soundwave rush over to notice Megatron doesn't seem to really give a crap. So we end up with a melancholy Megatron who doesn't seem to, despite what should be the glorious, death of his greatest enemy. Instead, he's like showing signs where he's not really very convinced he's dead, despite seeing him blow up just like everyone else did in front of him in the last issue, which we get like a page flashback on, which I guess is needed. I mean, it's like, babe, big deal here. Optimus Prime died, but maybe he's not, because we see they give us the foreshadowing of Optimus Prime being put on the floppy disk, which I'm sure was covered in the last issue very well. So I won't tread on too much here. But bottom line, Brawl thought Megatron's kind of being silly about this. He's like, hey man, he's dead. So Megatron proceeds to choke Brawl until his face explodes and then throw his body across the room. You gotta love Megatron. So we continue to see Megatron go absolutely insane, which Shockwave notes that he has gone mad. And so he decides to instead of trying to directly challenge him for leadership right now, or he might be a little too dangerous in one-on-one combat, he starts hatching a plan and starts feeding into Megatron's paranoia. So maybe his death was fake since he were doing it in a simulated game anyway. And now Megatron is excited to leave the base, and he begins destroying it as the army closes in. And Soundwave and Shockwave take over, making sure everything's actually done. because Megatron is a raving loon at this point. We also get a random roll call of Scramble City bots. Just very, very odd. It's a mixture of Stunticons and Combaticons. We get well, good thing they give us they list off everybody: Motormaster, Swindle, Vortex, Blastoff, Dragstrip, Dead End. It's the old style roll call, but not quite everyone on both teams, and they're moving away from the base. But first, we see what Shockwave's up to. He's contacts Cybertron, and he wants to bring basically a special team onto Earth. So Shockwave has called back to Cybertron, called the Trypticons, and we revealed their specialty is hunting down prey. He tells them the most dangerous prey of all, that being Megatron. He says, "Sure, okay, I understand." And then thus we set up the rest of the issue. Pretty funny scene of they take off on like just a generic weird red rocket, which kind of looks a bit like a Omega Supreme's arm or rocket mode, but it's not. It's like halfway, and he's just straddling it like a horse, Shockwave, and he's carrying Soundwave as a cassette, which you can barely make out in the coloring. But we've seen him transform the panel before. It's just, I don't know. It's just kind of awkward, and it's just kind of an awkward and funny scene, at least in my opinion. Cut back to Megatron traveling with the various Decepticons he's with. His paranoia has only grown over the last couple days, which I guess they don't travel magically like they do in the cartoon, as they're taking like a reasonable driving time to get from the coal mines down to South Florida, I guess. But he spots a red Arkliner truck, much like Optimus Prime, and destroys it. We see, of course, the human driver gets out just in time, and the majority of the Decepticons just kind of go and just like, I don't know, I guess you can kind of imply that Megatron's been kind of crazy this entire trip, and they're just like, yeah, he can catch up with us. So they leave Megatron alone with Dead End. And Dead End tries to say, well, Megatron, he's already dead. So clearly showing Megatron is completely out of his electronic mind. So the Predacons come down from the space bridge to Earth. They meet up with Shockwave, who tells them the plan. Basically involves like Megatron doesn't know them personally, so they're going to switch out their sigil signs for Autobots, and they're going to attack Megatron, which we see happen just as soon as Vortex takes off, takes Dead End away, and leaves Megatron alone. And we have the vicious battle of the Predacons versus Megatron. And it's a drag-out, tear-up battle. Megatron's holding his own, but there's 5 of them. They're tough, and they're just kind of tearing him apart. We go back to, and then Megatron's at the same time is ranting the entire time that they were sent by Optimus Prime. Even though they're already on deception, the Predacons say, no, we're just doing this for kicks. And he just doesn't buy it. And we cut back to Shockwave. He says he'll go investigate why Megatron hasn't radioed yet, and leaves Dead End and everyone else to their setting up the thermosilene thing. So back to the battle. The Predacons, realize, Megatron's just still too powerful. He's Decepticon leader for a reason. And, as much as they're messing him up, he's going to eventually take him out. So, of course, they combine into Predaking, and we get a continuation of the battle now with a much larger playing field for Megatron, trying to fight this combining robot, which, boy, sure is they... Remember when the Constructicons felt special only, 12 issues ago? But Megatron prevails in the battle, refusing help from even Shockwave, who shows up in some kind of weird, just trying to get, I guess, make Megatron trust him, I guess. And Megatron goes back to headquarters. Now he feels sure that Optimus Prime is dead. No one can withstand the might of Megatron. Look what he just did. Take out Predaking. he is still a mess, but he is the conquering victor here. We get a Soundwave here who's been playing both sides, I think, in most of these issues. I haven't really touched on that in the issues I've been reviewing, but I always thought that was an interesting take on this character. And he plays the sound clip of Megatron or Shockwave giving the order to the Predacons to kill Megatron. And of course, Shockwave says, "Hey, I did just give him the orders. I put my personality components inside them. I was basically controlling the entire time." He's like, "Dude, why are you bragging about this?" Suddenly, it's a slow realization that if Shockwave can do that, then possibly Optimus Prime could have had that done to him too. Which, of course, we know with the heavy foreshadowing we've been getting on that subject, we know is probably true. But it will be a while before we see the ends of that. But Megatron snaps again, deciding Optimus Prime lives, but he'll never catch him. No, not going to catch the Midnight Rider. And he blows himself up and the space bridge, and we assume that is the end of Megatron. And Soundwave congratulates Shockwave on his plan. He says, "You destroyed Megatron." He says, "No, a memory did." And that wraps up a couple issues in a row of, killing the two main leads in probably the stupidest ways possible. Say what you will about the movie, and I know it has its detractors, but Prime dies a noble death in battle, and Megatron is turned by a god into a new form. Way better than cheated at a video game and felt bad about it and went completely nutso crazy and killed himself. Of course, we will not be the end of Optimus Prime or Megatron in these comics, but it will be a while before we see through these characters. This was definitely around the era where Budansky definitely seemed a little burnt out and was starting to, the writing was really, really slipping. I was a kid and I loved everything Transformers. Some of these were just like, I could kind of see through it. Like they were just trying to get the characters off to introduce new characters. Like I could, I was old enough to realize what they were doing. And, and I thought like, man, these guys could have had better, more noble deaths, I guess. Anyway, definitely an issue I remember a lot from a kid, and one I read over and over again. I always loved the battle with Megatron and the Predacons. Always like to see a sign of, just how friggin' strong Megatron is. And it was a nice little send-off for him, I think, despite, the other annoyances with the whole madness issue, even though it's kind of addressed later, but getting ahead of myself. That's all I got. Back to you, Ant.
And of course, you can catch Gabe on his YouTube channel at youtube.com/recharge138. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about from this particular story. This is the probably most heavily edited of the books we're going to talk about today because of the UK version and, of course, of where the story is. Apparently, Megatron does meet the Predacons in an earlier issue of the Marvel UK run, which we'll cover when we get to 1987. That storyline is called Prey, Prey. And they also edited out the references to G.I. Joe and the Transformers, which wasn't published in the UK until 1990. And we'll be covering that series in episode 82 of Transformers University. So next episode, G.I. Joe and the Transformers. A couple of things I wanted to point out here. Dragstrip is misdrawn as Dead End. He's a yellow Porsche in one of the scenes when Megatron jumps into him. This is actually fixed in the UK version. He's colored and called Dead End in the word bubble. Gabe pointed out Shockwave flying on top of the hydrothermocline. I thought it was more interesting, not just that he was flying on it, but Shockwave was using his boosters in his feet to fly instead of just flying in his space gun mode, which he had done in previous issues. Also worth noting here, a lot of body horror in this issue, aside from Megatron crushing Brawl's head.
I'm crushing your head. I'm crushing your head.
You also had just the fight with the Megatron and the Predacons. A lot of There's a lot of damage to Megatron. He gets basically half his face ripped off. He gets part of the side of his head ripped off. He gets gored on the side. It's pretty intense for a children's comic. Finally, one more interesting edit from the UK version. In the scene where Megatron blows up the truck that he thinks is Optimus Prime, the final line on that page is Dead End saying, but Commander, he's already dead, as Megatron is talking about Optimus Prime. In the UK version, because this was the final page of the first half of the story, so the word bubble is edited to be from Megatron's point of view. So he leads in the same way with, and if it had been, he'd be dead. And then the follow-up line, which now comes from Megatron inside of Dead End instead of Dead End himself, Megatron says, and death will come to Optimus Prime. That is the closer for the UK version. I think that's a kind of a neat send-off to lead you into another issue. And that will lead us into our next issue, issue 26, Funeral for a Friend. And this one was written by Bob Budiansky, pencils by Don Perlin, inks by Brett Breeding. Brett Breeding, a longtime inker for Marvel and DC, worked on some really important comics, particularly the entire run of the Death of Superman, as well as the Return of Superman story. He's also the inker on the original West Coast Avengers 4-part miniseries and Spider-Man 252, the first regular issue to have Spidey appear in his black costume. Letters in this issue by Janice Chang, colors by Nel Yomtov, edits by Don Daly, and U.S. cover, also the cover for UK 109 by Herb Trimpe, and that features the villain for this issue, the Mechanic, standing in front of a number of Transformer bodies. UK issue 110, the second half of the story in the UK, is The Ark Under Attack by Jeff Anderson.
I'm taking it back. You watch.
And here we open on Ratchet trying to repair Optimus. It says he has been working for 238 straight hours. That is just 2 hours short of 10 days, by the way. And he has no luck as the Autobots look on. And we get a roll call of the Autobots here. And in the UK version, because of a previous story, Skids actually gets inked out of the UK version. So he's standing in the back in the US version, and he is blacked out in the UK version because he is not at the Ark. After Ratchet fails to revive Prime Perceptor, Ratchet and Omega Supreme check on the base's security system. Ratchet, he's just ready to quit everything, really, and gets a pep talk from his fellow doctor, First Aid. The Autobots, they're off to perform the funeral for Optimus Prime, but Ratchet stays behind at the Ark. He laments all of the Autobots who are damaged and on life support at the life support capsules. He pulls Prowl out of one of the drawers. It's kind of like a morgue, isn't it? And decides he is going to raid a junkyard for parts. At the junkyard, something is going down, and Ratchet hides in vehicle mode. So in the junkyard, there are three gentlemen, a guy by the name of Juan, his boss that we'll meet in a minute, named the Mechanic, and they're trying to cut a deal with a guy named Mr. Farley.
Hey, you remember when you were with the Beatles and you were supposed to be dead?
Before I go any further, working off of that SNL clip, I just want you to know that I had the chance to be on the set at Saturday Night Live once for a press conference. It's kind of cool because I got to kind of walk around the set and tour it and walk backstage and kind of see how everything works. On one of the stages, there's a low entrance, and it has an on-air light over the door. It's probably, you have to duck to get under it. It's probably maybe 5.5 feet, maybe just under 6 feet, this entranceway. And on the on-air sign, scribbled in pen, is the phrase, "Watch your head, Farley." And I'll be sure to tweet that one out. So it's kind of cool to see that little bit of history, a little bit behind the scenes. Chris Farley must have hit his head on that a whole bunch of times. And but he is not this Farley. This Farley is a cop.
Officer. Me off. Jack.
And he is ready to bust Juan and the mechanic, and they run and flee inside of this ambulance that was parked in the junkyard. Go figure. So Ratchet realizes he really can't do anything but go along with what's going on, and uses some of the tools in the back of his ambulance mode to shake the cops, which the mechanic promptly steals. Elsewhere, the funeral for Optimus Prime is beginning. He is loaded into beer. I had to look up what that word meant. That is a movable frame, which a corpse or a coffin is carried. In this sense, it is a shuttlecraft. Meanwhile, Ratchet confronts the mechanic and Juan, but the mechanic uses one of Ratchet's now stolen weapons to freeze him in place, and he concocts a plan. Back at the funeral, Perceptor eulogizes Optimus Prime, and then they launch his body into space. Sometime later, Ratchet thaws and heads back to the Ark. The mechanic and Juan, their plan was to trail him to find more weapons. Mechanic sneaks into the Ark and attacks Ratchet. He sees the Autobots returning from the funeral and turns on the defenses with this wrench that he finds.
My favorite wrench.
And it's not Sparkplug's wrench. It's some sort of special wrench that allows the mechanic to lift heavy objects. So the Autobots, they're getting slaughtered by their own base's defense system, and Ratchet flees into the base and ends up at the repair pods. He pulls Prowl out and repairs him quickly, and the mechanic shows up, and Prowl shows up in his vehicle mode, the police car, and flashes his lights. And because the mechanic is innately afraid of the police, he runs away. Ratchet thanks Prowl, but Prowl is still weak, and Ratchet then goes and shuts off the defenses. While picking up the damaged Autobots, Ratchet realizes he is needed now to focus on the living and not the dead. The end. And that won't be the last we see of the mechanic. He will return later on, but not in the next issue. That takes us to Marvel US number 27, Marvel UK numbers 111 through 112, story entitled King of the Hill. This one written by Bob Budiansky, pencils by Don Perlin, inks by Aiken and Garvey, colors by Nel Yomtov, letters by Janice Chang, and edits by Don Daly. Cover, once again, by Herb Trimpe of Trypticon, destroying a forest, fighting some Dinobots. And in the UK, issue 111 would feature art by Lee Sullivan with Grimlock asking for your vote. And they find tracks, not necessarily the Corvette, but actual tracks in the ground. The professor points out the smooth edges to the outside of the feet and says they are mechanically made and therefore a hoax, until they see Swoop in the sky. We cut to Swoop stealing an oil tanker from a diner, and then the Dinobots refueling, and they begin a march towards the Ark. At the Decepticons' New Florida home, Shockwave gets a call from his accountant, Ratbat. Yes, the Decepticon accountant. Shockwave convinces him to open the space bridge one more time, because Ratchet is not happy about how much energy the Decepticons on Earth are using. Back at the art, the Autobot leadership team, folks that do lead other teams, decide they need to pick a new leader, and Grimlock crashes this party. Back in the woods, one student named Rachel sees the space bridge appear and Trypticon come through. Trypticon transforms into his battle station and sends a little black scout car out of him named Wipeout. Now, Wipeout was not included with the original Trypticon. That was a fast track, a purple car. We would actually get a toy of him in the early 2010s based off of a Windcharger mold. At the Ark, Trypticon begins his attack with sonic scrambler mines that cause the Autobots to lose control of their ability to move. Then he starts to roll in. In the woods, the Dinobots were watching on, and they are watching Trypticon just attack the Autobots and thinking that he will just soften them up for Grimlock to become the leader. Grimlock then notices Rachel in the woods and respects that she is not scared of him. But then Rachel gets caught by Wipeout a few minutes later, and at Trypticon, Wipeout returns with Rachel, and Trypticon threatens to eat her. And Grimlock doesn't like that. So Grimlock attacks Trypticon, the other Dinobots join in, and they drive Trypticon away from his attack on the Ark. Then the space bridge reappears Rat-Bat radios in saying Trypticon is over his fuel allotment and he is ordered to return to Cybertron. That is right. The way we beat Trypticon is to make him run out of fuel and get called home by his mom. The rest of the Autobots, they're impressed with Grimlock. He showed all the right traits of a leader, from compassion to being a warrior to being decisive, and they name him the new leader. The end. That's right, folks. We end 1986 not with Optimus Prime as the leader of the Autobots in Marvel Comics, but Grimlock. And Grimlock as Autobot leader is going to lead to all sorts of interesting storylines. I really think this is where the comic does start to really branch off from the cartoon and really establish itself as its own thing. I mean, it's been its own thing on its own, since the start, but this is where the story is really taking an interesting take, because we have no Optimus Prime, we have no Season 3 characters, so we're getting a way for these other characters to have stories told as they work in the characters and toys from 1986 into the tales here in the Marvel Comics. So lots more fun stuff to come as we get into 1987, but this will wrap up 1986 for the Marvel Comics run. And of course, that also means we are going to wrap up this episode of Transformers University. Now, one new fun thing to note, and if you're on our Patreon, you already know about it. We now have a voicemail line. So if you want to call in, you want to leave a comment, you want to leave a message for me at Transformers University or just about TFU.info in general, you want something played on the show, you've got a feeling about any of these particular comics or anything we've talked about in previous episodes, the number to dial is 702-POD-4-TFU. So that is 702-POD, the number 4, TFU, and the numbers, that is 702-763-4838, 702-POD-4-TFU. Call up, leave me a message, and as long as it's not, terribly offensive, I'll play it on the show. Now, there's plenty of other ways to get in touch with me and get in touch with the show. You know all of them if you're a regular listener, so I'll go through them quickly. Twitter at TFU_info. Facebook.com/TFU_info. Instagram.com/TFU_info. The Patreon, patreon.com/TFU_info. And of course, the YouTube channel, youtube.com/TFU_info. I'm working on some more great content. I'm also working on the updates to the website. The year 2002 has been moved into the new look, and I'm starting on 2003 already. I'm already one page into the 378, and hoping to have more done, preferably by the end of this week, now that we're in, these shelter-in-place orders. Also have some plans to appear on some other podcasts, so please keep an eye on the Twitter feed for that. Next time on the show, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be covering G.I. Joe and the Transformers, the limited series from Marvel from 1986 that was the first published Transformers crossover. And I'll talk a little bit about crossovers in general as well. So, until next time, I am Anthony Brucali, owner, operator, madman behind TFU.info. Stay home, stay safe, wash your hands. See ya.